What's up, guys? So, I'm back home after a nice family trip, and I was thinking a few things. I'm like, what have I not covered on YouTube in a while? And something made me think. I'm like, okay, injector sizing, how that affects injection timing, and probably my favorite of all of them, how do we want to control the torque of an engine when we are near the limiter? Now, how many of you guys can think, I like drifting? Or, banging off the limiter to shift the car at the peak torque for the next gear? Or, how about simply using drive-by-wire as a torque optimization tool? So, let me kick that off first. We'll say throttle body. I am a drive-by-wire guy. It's exactly where I can say I want this much torque. I want to have something to where as the engine goes up in RPM and I'm trying to catch that engine making its peak power, I want to do like an OEM, which will take that throttle blade and it'll shut it slowly and slowly and slowly until it catches the engine with a lack of airflow. You guys might ask, why would you want to do that? Well, if we stop the engine with a fuel cut, essentially leaning out the engine, that's a common practice. It doesn't work for every application, specifically rotary stuff. And then we've got ignition cut, or in this case, ignition retard is much more common. And so if we're pulling ignition out and out and out, that's essentially like two-stepping at the limiter. Also quite a bit more aggressive than if you were simply just to cut the airflow back. So what would you rather do? Would you rather make the engine gently catch itself, or do you want to slam into that limiter really hard, cutting ignition and essentially jiggling and jostling all of the internal components of the engine? Well, to me, that's a no-brainer, right? I would always want to keep things to be smoother, easier operational on the internal components of the engine. So I would say drive-by-wire is the way to go for that. And then as a perk, as you're tuning that sort of stuff, you should really be taking the time to build a torque model off of your drive-by-wire. What that means is you can lock the maximum opening of a throttle position on the drive-by-wire itself. And you can say at 40% opening, I make this much power at this given RPM or this duty cycle or whatever you want to do to create a feed forward table, which gives you a torque output and a horsepower output for a given throttle position. And you keep doing this until you have a full model of a sweep of the throttle. And in the situation to where you are traction limited, which is always because you're hopefully making some good power, you're now saying, oh, well, this is simple. At this condition of this tire slippage, I want to have the drive-by-wire maximum to now shift down to hold my torque output. Boom. Nailed it. And what that does is it creates this environment to where you're always optimizing the tire of the vehicle, and you're doing so in a very smooth manner. It's not ignition cut, not ignition retard, but you're using the drive-by-wire for its job, slowing the engine down or maintaining a power output that is optimized for the chassis at the given time. So that's the first thing, right? And this is kind of one of the better, newer perks of all the Intron stuff. I'm an Intron boy. Hey, it's pretty cool. That being said, I do tune everything. And on that, I'll get into injector sizing. So injectors will have a very large linear reaction, which means that, let's say, between 2% duty cycle and 82% duty cycle, that thing is a complete linearized perfect relationship all the way through of its operation. Past 82% duty cycle, you might have a little bit more flow, a little bit less flow, a little more flow, a little less. It's just going to move around, right? There's never going to be consistency at that point after the, let's say, 80 or 82% duty cycle, because that little solenoid, which is what it is hanging open, heating up, open indefinitely. 100% duty cycle would just be open indefinitely, and the injector gets hot. Okay. Now below that, let's say 2% duty cycle, you're going to have what's called an injector knee. And this is the dead spot of inconsistency below, just like above, you have inconsistency over around 82%. Each injector is different. Now below is below the knee. And where would this end up happening? Well, idle cruise, if you have a very light cruise, a prime example would be, let's say you have, now I love ID stuff. Let's say that you have an ID 2600X on a, let's say, a cylinder size that's under 600 cc. Okay. And so that could be like a stroked 2JZ, 6-cylinder, 3.4 liter. Divide that by 6. Okay. You get the idea. That, with ID 2600 on pump gas, wanting to be streetable is not going to be very good. Why is that the case, and what can you do about it? Well, there's this thing called a short pulse width adder, which will help account for the discrepancies of the injector knee region, and that will help to a degree. But at that same engine on pump gas, you might be down to 0.6 duty cycle, 0.6% duty cycle, which is well below the linear region of the injector. And what that's going to end up doing is sometimes that will be perfect, sometimes it won't be perfect. And ideally, that engine, instead of being at 0.6 duty cycle, you'd rather be off with 2 sets of injectors, a primary and secondary stage, with maybe a 1050X and a 1700X, which will equate to more fuel total than the 2600 primary that you would have just had for one injector. But now you've split that fuel load, and you're going to be at roughly, instead of 2600, now you're at 1050. You're going to be at roughly 1.5 to 2% duty cycle, right? So what does that do? That makes that car now idle perfectly fine. Now when it goes to cruise, you're trying to cruise the stoichiometric values, you're trying to idle at stoichiometric values, it's gaining that consistency to where it's buttery smooth. Now, this is just one prime example. Injector sizing will work for just about anything, but the most common fault that I've come across, that I've seen from my peers, or whatever you want to call it, is that they don't understand that when you, and maybe they do, but they don't understand how to implement this. When you go with a larger injector, that means that your injection time, the injection timing event, whether it's end of injection or start of injection point for that injector at a given engine period, that is going to be changing and be much, much more, I want to say precise, but it's much more influential in how the engine's operating with the larger the injector you go. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's say you've got on a rotary, prime example, a 550cc injector. You're running that thing 8 milliseconds, 12 milliseconds, very, very high durations. So it's always high duty cycle of that injector, which means the time that it starts or the time that it ends the injection is far less critical than if you have a large injector, which means that you can flow much more fuel in a very short period of time. So the bottom line is that your injection time has to be much more precise for a larger injector. You need to burst the fuel and then you stop the injection. So I'm not sure if this is a common occurrence of tuners that are implementing some of these software programs. A lot of times injection timing is way off. Now you can have what they call an open valve situation or a closed valve situation for end of injection. I won't go into that in this video, but some theories are better than others for why you'd want to have one thing or the other. But for the most part, I think we can agree that closed valve injection time is a more common trait, because now you're bouncing fuel off of a valve, atomizing it before it gets there. Valve opens, sucks in atomized fuel and air. That's generally the consensus of what works best. Versus the valve being open, you time it to be right in that small period of time when it's open, and then you're aiming and hoping to get a fuel injection in, and then atomizes inside the cylinder with the swirl effect there. Of course, we don't have most of our port injection cars firing directly at the valve very close, so we would be timing this based on engine velocity and pressure, in which all this should be changing as a value based on engine load. So what that means is if the car is running higher boost pressure, that's the difference of cylinder pressure in this case to what it's being fed from the manifold, and an engine RPM that is high or low, well, the air velocity and what's carrying that fuel is going to change, and therefore the injection timing will change for that event. So that's why when you see these locked injection timing things for tables, that's usually not the right approach, because, well, you're going to be changing that based on engine speed, or at least you should. A really smart way of doing this is actually doing it off duty cycle. It'd just be the same thing as like an electronic drive-by-wire style e-wastegate. You do it by flow, right? That's going to be a better approach for that. So without making this too much more convoluted, most things that we're starting to control more and more with cars, ECUs, all this stuff, look to the OEMs. They're always at least a decade ahead of anyone in the aftermarket. So when they go and they say, we're going to control this engine by drive-by-wire, opening and closing, that's going to be the way to do it for reliability. that's going to be the way to do it for performance. That's going to be the way for torque modeling. When you go to size your injectors, think about where the vehicle is being used, what fuel is being used, and why this is a good selection for that vehicle. Do you have the ECU capability of running multiple stages? Do you want to use pump gas, E85, and methanol? That's a lot of work, right? Or is it ethanol only, or methanol only, or pump gas only, right? All these things will dictate injector sizing, and these are very simple calculations to get this dialed in. I'm happy to help anyone who has a problem with this, because reach out, drop me an email. This is something that's like 10 minutes of work, get you dialed to where you can meet your expectations and have good drivability so you can enjoy your car. And then injection timing. It seems like, to me, I've gone through enough. You're finding what's the rich point at certain injection points of a car. You're seeing what revs the most crisp. You're seeing how the engine operates in regards to I've even seen air intake temperature change as a result of this, because port injection will affect this. There's just small nuances that you should notice by changing this and getting this correct. When it's incorrect and the trends are incorrect, you may have really good sweet spots, and then the rest of the mapping is kind of dull. And so that's why this needs to be a very particularly patient process of getting this done right. And like I said, bigger injectors, the more precise it has to be. So take your time. Reach out if you guys have any questions. The next set of videos will be quite a bit more professional than this. I just wanted to kind of get this off the top of my head and have some fun with it. So catch you guys later. Hope that helps a few of you with a little bit more technical stuff. And if this is what you want to see more of, I have an introduction to EFI course set up. I have one advanced rotary video that ended up being very much disliked. It was a seminar, so probably won't show that one. And then we've got a bunch of build video progress for the ARC-7. So I can get to that soon. But yeah, this is just a new office setup. That's it. Catch you guys in the next one. Cheers.